great pleasure to introduce Judy Gillett-Ferguson on the history of art in Gawler.
This is very stressful, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, because I've never given a PowerPoint display before, and certainly not with someone sitting in front of me photographing me the whole time. So, anyway, I'd like to thank the history team for inviting me to talk to you this evening. Before I begin, I'd like to make a couple of disclaimers. Firstly, I've tried to be as diligent as possible in my research. But I may well have made errors or misinterpretations of something I've read that you, as well-informed Gawlerites, may not agree with or may know a bit more about. And I'm conscious too that I can have quite easily, but unintentionally, left out an artist once active in our area, or one who still is, and for that I apologise in advance. If that is the case, I would really love to hear any alternative theories or further information at the close of my talk. In fact, I'm sure we all would. So don't be shy in contributing to this ongoing discovery and discussion. When Brian first asked me to present a history of art in Gawler, I was dismayed. What history of art? Apart from what I knew of contemporary art in Gawler, you know, right here and now, I knew very little about the art and artists of an earlier Gawler. Sadly, the several books written about Gawler over the years have very scant information. So I began to dig, and the more I dug, the more I discovered. Needless to say, people have been creating works of art in and around Gawler for thousands of years. I've tried to put this talk in some sort of chronological order, and I've only dodged about a little bit. So to begin at the beginning, no historical record of art in Gawler or our local region, and I have covered more than just Gawler in this talk, would be true or complete without going back before European settlement, before 1836. When Adelaide was first settled by Europeans. There is ample evidence that the original people of this area, the Gawler, who are the custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the Peremank of the Mount Lofty Ranges, were creating artistic records for the many, many thousands of years prior to European arrival. Gawler sits at the conjunction of the Gawler and Peremank traditional lands. They and Indigenous people all over Australia produced many varied forms of artistic expression and communication throughout our huge country, using locally sourced and or traded ochres and other art materials. Unfortunately, in our area, which falls into the traditional lands of the Gawler and Peremank, very few examples of their art now remains. But what is left shows that they were accomplished artists, and some of their rock paintings and carvings still exist locally in the valley of the South Para River, near Eden Valley, and in the Kaiserstuhl National Park and elsewhere. And I have selected two examples of these to show you. The first one, it's red ochre figures with faint white outlines located in a shelter at South Para. And the other, I'll give you a few minutes to look at that, seconds to look at that. The other is a set of spirals carved into the vertical rock surface of a boulder in the Kaiserstuhl Conservation Park. Can everybody see them all right? Yes? Yeah. These photos were taken from the Robin Coles and Peremank elder Richard Hunter's book, The Ochre Warriors, Peremank Culture and Rock Art in the Mount Lofty Ranges, published by Axiom Australia in 2012. Sadly, Richard Hunter died not long after the book was published. At this distance in time, it is not clear what significance these artworks had for the people who created them. But rock carving alone, as you might imagine, is very time-consuming and arduous, especially when done with the limited tools then available. So we can safely assume that these artworks had considerable importance to their creators. The Indigenous people of our area also created a very wide variety of portable artefacts, as suited their lifestyle. The South Australian Museum holds samples and displays of Gawler, Paramank and other South Australian Indigenous groups decorated and constructed artefacts, clothing and tools. Some Indigenous artefacts were removed and sent to the South Australian Museum from the Gawler Institute in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Indigenous people are also intricate weavers, leather and feather workers and wood carvers. The details of their more ephemeral artistry, such as wooden tools, weapons, reed and grass weaving, fur and feather garments, and the recorded history of it, we can now glean from their own oral tradition and remembered craftsmanship. The small collection that still remains in the South Australian Museum, and the records of European artists and photographers and later anthropologists who thought to reproduce and depict it either with drawings and paintings or later photography. George French Angus and William Starnes, and he lived from 1815 to 1882, and Alexander Schramm from 1814 to 1864, are some of the early colonial artists to whom we're indebted for their early detailed paintings of the Gawler and Paramank life and artistry. Much of their work can be viewed at the Art Gallery of South Australia and at the museum, and I will discuss in more detail a bit later on the work of these artists. But for now I'll show you, first of all, Schramm's painting of an Aboriginal encampment. And that's at Humbug Scrub, so that's not far from where we are. The next one is, so I'm sorry about the quality of these, I'm still learning my skills as a PowerPoint deliverer and photographer, but they are paintings by George French Angus of the Gawler people, and they are important historic records. And lastly, William Starnes' painting of a corroboree. This is an encampment by Schramm. And this is near Kensington, where Kensington now is. It's a very big, detailed portrait of people doing all kinds of things in their daily lives. So that's what Adelaide, when Adelaide was first settled, that's what the Aboriginal people's lives were like, living close, cheek by jowl with Europeans. As I mentioned earlier, most of our local rock artwork is undecipherable. The book's foreword states, oh, that is a bit better, isn't it? Yes, thank you. This book, and I'm quoting from it, does include previously unrecorded sites. The art is unique to South Australia, and prior to its publication, many had not been documented. Unfortunately, many of the art symbols have been lost to the Paramank, and we can only compare works from neighbouring Aboriginal regions to draw out their meaning. The link with Indigenous art is a continuous thread across Indigenous territorial boundaries and across time to the present day, where we still celebrate our local Indigenous artists like Scott Rathbun and Margaret Ferrugia, who have contributed richly to the art scene in modern day Gawler, and I'm going to talk a bit more about them a bit later. The next wave of art historically for South Australia was also before European settlement, but was nonetheless European, and it had significance for the decision to build a European settlement in South Australia. On Thursday the 8th of April 1802, Matthew Flinders, on board the Investigator, met French captain Nicolas Baudin on Le Géographe in Encounter Bay, South Australia, hence the name that bay was given by Flinders. Flinders had been charged by the powers that be in London with charting the unknown coast, as it was termed, from the Great Australian Bight to the Victorian border. The Napoleonic War was still raging in Europe, but the two captains respected each other as sincere cartographers, geographers and explorers. We see this mutual respect in the fact that when South Australia became a British colony, only 30 years later, many of Baudin's original French place names were retained by Flinders and adopted by the new colonists. Flinders discovered both Spencer and St Vincent's Gulfs, thus proving there was no sea channel through to the centre of the country. And he also found Kangaroo Island to be a good source of fresh meat and water, information that he shared with Baudin. As I mentioned just now, although their countries are at war, these scientists respected each other. However, the French governor of the island of Mauritius, however, did not, and on his way back to the UK, Flinders visited the island and for repairs to his ship and was immediately arrested and held as a political prisoner for 6 years. He died not long after returning home to England at the age of 40. On board these two ships were 4 very talented artists. Their work and pictorial recordings were essential for creating the most accurate records possible of scenery, flora and fauna to be conveyed back to their homelands for scientific analysis and for information, and in Flinders' case, for the Royal Geographic Society in London, and especially for Sir Joseph Banks, who had been Cook's botanist on the Endeavour. On Flinders' ship, the HMS Investigator, was Ferdinand Bauer. He was a Prussian by birth who lived from 1760 to 1826 and was very experienced botanical and fauna artist and watercolourist. He was selected for the voyage by Joseph Banks, who admired the accuracy and detail of his work. For his work, Bauer used a colour reference chart, and this is intriguing, I think, probably with 1,000 different shades. This was a common practice among travelling artists at the time, who were unable for personal or practical reasons to carry all the shades of colour that they might require or time to colour completely or accurately a picture they were producing while travelling. Sadly, Bauer's original chart has been lost, but it has been possible by comparing the real bird, and I'll show you this in a minute, bird's colours to his existing detailed annotated sketches. So this is a crimson rosella, which was sketched by Bauer, and you can see on the, I hope you can see that there are numbered and marks all over his feathers. Each of those numbers, and I'm sorry it's so unclear, he could refer back to a chart when he got back to France, and then he could paint an almost completely accurate painting of that bird by using that chart. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And this is also what he was capable of. And that's a koala with a Sturt Desert bee at front. Very, very good artist. Also on the Investigator was William Westall, who was born in Hertford in England in 1781. He was only 19 when they sailed from England, and so a generation younger than Bauer. He mainly specialised in landscapes and made some of the first coastal landscapes of Western and South Australia. He was the only first fully professional artist to create landscapes. And this is a picture of Westall's showing the north side of Kangaroo Island. You can see there's seals there. I'm just sorry, they are much clearer than this in real life, but I don't know if it's my camera or me or what it is. And you can see there's kangaroos. So these are some of the first pictures of South Australia painted by anyone. Okay, so I just need to find where I am. On Baudin's ship, the Le Geographe, was Charles Alexander Le Sueur. He was born in Le Havre in France and was an exquisite fauna and flora painter in watercolour, extremely observant and detailed. In fact, there was an exhibition at the Maritime Museum in Port Adelaide about 2 years ago, which showed these artists' works. We would now describe his work as photographic realism. This was such an important skill before actual photography. His work was much admired by the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, which is the Natural History Museum in Paris, and amongst those professors were names that might ring a bell with some of us. Messieurs Bougainville, Lacépède, Saint-Vincent or St. Vincent and Fleuriot, who were responsible for recommending him to the Baudin exhibition. That is a beautiful... I mean, painting a jellyfish once it's dried out is not easy, so you can imagine the difficulty in painting that. Absolutely exquisite detail in watercolour. And that's a leather jacket. Once again, beautiful detail, and he's even detailed the jaws of the fish at the bottom. Beautiful work, and very, very important for the future establishment of our colony. The other artist on the geograph was Nicolas Martin Petit, who lived from 1777 to 1804, and he was born in Paris, and he was only 25 at the time of the voyage. And he too was selected by Baudin because of his fine, accurate work. He painted some beautiful, respectful and sensitive portraits of Aboriginal people, as well as scenery. His drawings of the indigenous people of New South Wales and Tasmania are a rare and precious account of the actual lifestyle of the Aborigines at the beginning of the 19th century. That's a beautiful portrait, and when you think about what attitudes were like to the indigenous people at the beginning of the 19th century, which is when this was painted, this is a very respectful and accurate portrait. These four artists had a very strong influence in encouraging the European settlement of South Australia. Once colonisation began, some 30 years later, however, in 1836, a new body of artists were emerging who would portray the new settlement of Adelaide and its surrounds, the lives of the pioneers and explorers and the indigenous people that they were displacing. Gawler, Colonel Light's only other planned town after Adelaide, was first settled in 1839, and most European pictorial work of and near its vicinity was done by artists not living in Gawler, but in Adelaide. One of the first of these, and probably for us the most important, was William Light himself. He was born in Kuala Kedah, which is now in modern Malaysia, in 1786. And he's rather a tragic figure in the history of our state. After war experience in Spain, he travelled widely, and Kelly Henderson researched Light's life and work in her thesis, William Light's Adelaide, The Genius of Place and Plan, published in 2008 at the University of South Australia. And she says of him, he observed great art and architecture and painted townscapes, landscapes, seascapes, people and antiquities with accuracy and sensitivity. In 1836, Light, a talented artist and skilled surveyor, ran foul of the first state governor, John Heinrich, who thought he knew better than Light where the site of Adelaide should be. And Light, who was then mortally ill with TB, struggled to resist his bullying. But in the end, he did prevail and was helped by his colleagues in the colony. He did, however, give up his official government surveyor role before he laid out Gawler in 1839. Light sold many of his paintings while he was dying, just to make ends meet, and he died in Adelaide shortly after planning Gawler. This is a picture of Light's paintings, done in 1839, very, very close to his death actually, only months before. The first one is 14 miles north of the Para Pass, which is, Para Pass is the old name for Dead Man's Pass. And then we have his perhaps much better known Dead Man's Pass picture. We have his picture of Dead Man's Pass there, and the tree on the left is the tree that the body was supposed to be found in. Let there be peace, and there was peace. Okay, so that's Light, and between 1836 and 1860 the new colony had an impressive list of artist chroniclers arriving, many of whom I have not listed here as they did not paint or draw aspects of our local area. Those who did include John M. Skipper, who arrived in South Australia in 1836, Martha Barclay, who arrived in 1837. She did lithographs of the Barossa Valley, which I've been unable to find copies of, unfortunately. She was South Australia's first professional artist, doing many miniatures. She also did many lovely watercolours of early Adelaide and its European inhabitants, and was one of many women painting in the colony at this time. Very few women artists got up this way to paint during this period, for fairly obvious reasons, I think. Some did teach art, but they were often confined to their homes and immediate surroundings for the subjects they could paint. Richard E. Minchin arrived in 1850, and he's an ancestor of the talented composer, writer and musician and actor Tim Minchin. Minchin painted scenes at Pewsey Vale and other Barossa Valley scenes. He was also the founder of the Adelaide Zoo and clashed with Gawler local Richard Schomburg over wanting to take some of the Botanic Gardens acreage for the new zoo. It seems he won. More on Schomburg later. John Michael Skipper was born in Norfolk and arrived in Adelaide on the Africaine in 1836 to a very, very new pre-proclamation tiny colony. He was a lawyer and was articled to Charles Mann, the then Advocate General. Much of his time, I suspect, was spent travelling around painting scenes of the life around him, because he bunked off to the Victorian goldfields in the 1850s, like fellow artist S.T. Gill. But unlike Gill, Skipper returned to Adelaide and died at his farm in Kent Town, aged 68. And this is a picture of Skipper's landscape painted in 1838, a view of Pewsey Vale in the Barossa Valley. Samuel Thomas Gill was one of the most famous of the early Adelaide artists and was always known as S.T. Gill. And he had about 20 varieties of his signature on his paintings. He was born in Somerset in 1818, and so he was a contemporary of Skipper's. Watercolours are easy to carry, and if, like Gill, you're moving about a lot, it's an ideal medium to use. Gill arrived in Adelaide in 1839, the year that Gawler was founded, and made a great many beautifully detailed and animated paintings of life in early Adelaide, and some near Gawler, including a lovely watercolour of William Younghusband's property, Floraville, near Gawler on the North Para, and part of Light's original survey. So this is Gill's painting of Floraville. Once again, I apologise for the blurring. Gill also painted scenes near Mount Crawford and Gawler River and further north. He was one of the first to paint life at the Kapunda Mines and at the Angus property, Terra Water, near Anguston. His works are important records of life in the early colony. He also painted many pictures of Gowner life in and around Adelaide, and I showed you one of those earlier on.
That's famous, was it?
I think it's a bit good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. In his book entitled S.T. Gill, The South Australian Years, Ron Redford, who was a former curator of the gallery, wrote, "In his last years in Melbourne, Gill also painted large watercolour landscapes of South Australia. They were based on sketches from the 1840s and on his very good visual memory. And it's interesting to note that although the small community of the colony of South Australia was well endowed with landscape painters for its first 15 years, Colonel Light being the first, there was no resident landscape painter from the 1850s to the end of the century." And that's an interesting fact. Whether they all went to the goldfields or not, I don't know, but a lot of them did. Instead, in Adelaide, there were numerous figure and portrait painters like John Crossland, Schramm, who I mentioned earlier, Charles Hill, John Irvine, Andrew McCormack, John Upton and Louis Tannant. This was unusual for an Australian colony, for as is well known, in the second half of the 19th century, Australia's strong landscape tradition was well established, and it was not until the beginning of the 20th century that landscape tradition in South Australia was revived, principally by Hans Huyssen. I've said maybe the rush to the goldfields explains that. Another prolific local artist at this time was George French Angus, who I've talked about before. He arrived in 1844 and painted some of the earliest views of Adelaide and surrounding country. He was born in Newcastle and died at the age of 42 back in 1886. He and his brother John Howard Angus invited Gill to his property in Anguston about the time of his brother George French's arrival. He'd commissioned Gill to produce images of his property in Anguston and the Barossa Valley. These were used to encourage the sale of land owned by their father George Fife Angus, who was still in England. And here are some of Gill's pictures of areas around Mount Crawford, and a scene near Gawler. George French Angus arrived at Anguston in 1845, not long after Gill's visit there. He was 21 and a precocious naturalist and artist. It is to him we owe much of what we know about what the Indigenous people's lives and culture was like at the beginning of white settlement. His paintings of them appear accurate and respectful, which was a rarity. A year later, he held the colony's first one-man exhibition after frenetically racing all over the place, including to New Zealand in that time. Things you can do when you're 21. Here are a few of his works pertaining to our area, some of which were painted within a year of his arrival. The first one are similar to the ones I showed earlier, very important records of Gawler weapons and implements. This is his property on the Gawler River at near Anguston. This is the village of Bethany, near Tanunda. Yes. All by George French Angus. This is the opening of the Free Chapel at Anguston, near Gawler Pass, done at the same time. And this is the Lindock Valley, looking north towards the Barossa Valley, painted in 1847. Salem Valley, which is where one of the paintings was done, was one of those places that lost its German name during World War I, when it was changed to Tapper Pass. Angus wrote some interesting notes on this painting, and I'll show you this one. If you could just see on this tree here, you can see marks going up the tree. The Aboriginal people used those, and they put a stick in them, and then climbed, and then put another stick and climbed, and they would get birds out of hollows or possums and so on. So it's a way of...
You're right.
A way of catching animals. And this is what, after he'd painted that, this is what Angus wrote. The plate represents the trunk of an aged gum tree or eucalyptus on the banks of one of the waterholes on the River Gawler. The marks in the bark are incisions or cuts made by the natives with their climbing sticks. The locality of this subject is on the Gawler River at Salem Valley, about 2 miles from German Pass. At the season when this view was taken, which is February, the grass around was parched in many places, and the course of the river marked only by a succession of deep waterholes. German artist Alexander Schramm arrived not long after Angus in 1849, and he too painted local scenes. Schramm, one of the first professional artists to arrive in the colony, had studied art at the Berlin Academy, thus bringing with him other than English artist or artistic traditions. He had travelled widely in Europe before coming here, and as you saw earlier in that beautiful Gawler encampment painting which he did, he was intrigued by the lives of the Indigenous people he lived beside. That painting was one of the largest and best executed paintings in 1850 of an Aboriginal encampment near what is now Kensington. And this is another one by Schramm, who painted paintings like a lot of artists did on commission. So if someone would say, I want you to paint me, or I want you to paint my family, and I'll give you some money. This is the Gilbert family, after whom the Gilbert Valley is named. There are 6 members of the Gillett family there, and over on the left you can see an Aboriginal groom holding a horse. It's not. So we have Joseph and his wife Anna, who are central, with an Aboriginal groomsman on the left, sadly but not surprisingly nameless, and a governess, Miss Nicholson, who are on their property at Pewsey Vale. Schramm died not long after completing this painting in November 1864. That same year, R.E. Minchin, and 14 years after him the Reverend Alfred Sells, painted that same large split gum tree, which is depicted in Schramm's painting. Unfortunately, the tree has since been destroyed by fire. Like many colonial artists at that time, Schramm received many commissions for portraits, group pictures and landscapes. He was followed by artists like James Shaw, who lived from 1815 to 1881, and who in 1862 painted the Smith homestead at Smithfield. So that's what Smithfield looked like once, in 1862. Shaw is a little known or appreciated colonial artist who painted a number of landscapes and homesteads in Adelaide and around the state. Interestingly, one of his paintings came up for auction just earlier this year in Adelaide and was sold, and there is a strong likelihood that that painting is of Gawler. But because it is currently in private hands, I'm unable to provide any more details on it. Shaw had come originally from Scotland and arrived in Adelaide in 1847. He was a qualified lawyer. There's a few of them around. Of course, he had to reflect on how many of these artists had law as a sideline. To be able to have time to paint, the colony was either very law-abiding at this time, which I doubt, or law did not have the same appeal as painting in the open air. Shaw was also a printmaker and pioneer photographer. Many of his works were exhibited by the South Australian Society of Art. The State Gallery holds 7 of his works, including 2 specifically of Gawler. One of Stephen King's home, Kingsford House, and the other, Gawler Town from the south, are among them. The town of Gawler now has the latter original oil painting done in the mid-1860s. The State Library hold a lithograph of it, and its website describes the work as follows. A lithograph based on a drawing by James Shaw, drawn upon stone by Penman and Galbraith. It is a panoramic view showing the roads, buildings, fields and gardens of the township. A couple out walking wave to a man with his horse and cart. In the foreground, a goat surveys the scene, and on the back of the photograph it says Gawler from the south, 1866 to 1867. Now, the original painting that this lithograph was taken from is probably amongst the collection still to be taken out and dusted.
Yes.
Okay, and very valuable. Shaw was one of the painters operating in Adelaide and Gawler at this time. He came back to Gawler in 1860 and painted John Mckinley's house. Colonial artists often visited places like Adelaide and Gawler. S.T. Gill was one of them, to paint prominent houses on a commission. They also occasionally sketched townships and then painted a section. We come now to Edward Snell, who was born in Devon in 1820. His father died very young, and Snell was encouraged to become an engineer by an older cousin. He worked in various places in Somerset before gaining a position with the very newly emerging railways. He emigrated to Adelaide in 1849, where he began painting and surveying. He is another one who went to the Victorian goldfields in 1852 and amassed a fortune. He then worked as an engineer for a Melbourne railway company. He didn't do very well at this and lived for a time in Geelong. He returned to England in 1858 to retire with his fortune. He died at his home in Cornwall in 1880. He wrote and illustrated a very irreverent diary entitled The Life and Adventures of Edward Snell, which was not meant for publication and was filled with many watercolours. And I believe that this drawing first appeared in that diary. I got it from Whitelock's book, who references Snell's diary in his bibliography, and it's the old Spot Inn.
Oh, right.
Another artist at this period is also of special interest to Gawlerites, Andrew McCormack. Born in Ireland in 1826, he studied at Leeds Academy in London in 1852, before migrating to Melbourne in 1856, where he studied for the church and was ordained a Baptist minister in 1867. In 1868, he arrived in Adelaide. He was a Baptist pastor in Moonta before moving to North Adelaide in 1871 and retired from the church to pursue a professional painting career, setting up a studio in Rundle Street in 1880. He was a prolific portraitist, painting many commissioned portraits of prominent citizens and civic leaders, often travelling out into the country towns to do so, and Gawler was one of the places he came to. The town of Gawler is very fortunate to have 7 McCormack portraits, 2 of them of James Martin, who lived from 1821 to 1899, and whose influence on the town, as you all probably know, was far-reaching, lasting for half a century after he arrived in Gawler in 1848 from Cornwall. One of his portraits was recently acquired by the town of Gawler. I'm not sure when it was painted, but it's of an older James Martin than this one, which was painted in 1877 and is owned also by the town of Gawler. These pictures of McCormack portraits are taken from the Gawler Library's booklet, so my photographs are reproductions of reproductions. While we're thinking of James Martin and the numerous foundries that existed in Gawler at this time, it's worth remembering, I think, the magnificent cast iron lace that decorates so many of the buildings and those beyond our town. The designs for these pieces were mainly imported, but their construction took place here, and are no less works of art for all that. The Four Seasons bench, a specimen which is now in the National Trust Museum in Gawler, is a good example of this form of art. It was made in Thompson's Eagle Foundry in King Street in the early 20th century. Some beautiful originally designed and wrought iron lace is still being made in Gawler by contemporary local metalwork artists like Andrew Fragnito, and this is one of Andrew's pieces in East Terrace. So the art has not died, it's still existing. Now back to McCormack. The dates in the Gawler Library's pamphlet on the reading room portraits of Leonard Burton, George Warren and William Barnett are all given as 1895. But interestingly, all 3 of those gentlemen died in the February of that year. If the dates of the paintings are correct, and they were done from life, they must have been done in January or early February. If not, they must have been done posthumously, and I'll go into that mystery a bit more later. George Knott's portrait was painted in 1877, and John Mckinley's in 1880, with his name misspelled for some reason. Mckinley's widow Jane donated his portrait to the Institute on March the 11th, 1889. Other McCormacks hang in the South Australian Parliament House, the Art Gallery of South Australia, and the Northern Territory Museum of Arts and Science. So once again, I apologise for the condition of these. These are portraits of Knott, Warren and Mckinley. So Knott, Warren, sorry, that's Knott, previous one was Warren, and this one is McKinley. Warren and, sorry, where are we? The 1895 mystery and the sad postscript and conundrum surrounding the deaths of Burton, Warren and Barnett concerns the horrific accident that befell the first 2 men on February the 25th, 1895. Warren and his good friend Burton were travelling in Warren's horse and buggy from Roseworthy when they were hit by a train at a level crossing near Roseworthy. Burton was pretty much dead on arrival at Gawler, but Warren lingered about a day longer and then succumbed to his injuries. It appears Barnett's death was also indirectly caused by the accident that killed two of his close friends, because I discovered he died suddenly after attending their funeral on the 25th of February. So we have a mystery. When were the portraits actually painted? Are all the dates correct? Could they have been done later that year by McCormack from photographs, as photography was a popular and prevalent art form in itself by this time? The paintings are, I think, almost identical to their photos. What do you think? Okay, so we have... Now that's the paintings, and now you can see the portrait. Okay, so you can see, I'll go back if you like. There's the photographs. Here's the paintings. Oh, that's... Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? Okay. Now we come to James Harris, who also has his portrait in the reading room. And these will all be reinstated when the reading room and the whole of the Civic Centre is finished, by the way. They're not going to go away. James Harris was painted by a photographer, but not McCormack. He was painted by a man called Saul Solomon in 1879. Solomon was also an artist, but primarily a photographer, with a studio in Rundle Street. So this one too may well have been done from a photograph. Harris was a merchant and an importer of agricultural machinery and involved in the life of the town. He was also a member of Gawler's first town council. I suspect that quite a few portrait paintings were done from photos, and of course they still are. This in no way denigrates the artist's skill, but when one looks at the contemporary photos of some of the sitters, I think it's a bit of a giveaway. On the 4th of January 1887, Governor Gawler's tinted pen and ink sketch of the Battle of Barossa was presented to the Gawler Institute by him. In his book, Whitelock describes it as one of the indisputable jewels of the Institute's archives, and he goes on to say, it raises the question of whether Governor Gawler had been present at the battle, or whether in fact Colonel Light drew the sketch, because it looks like his work. And Gawler bought it when Light was selling off his treasures to make ends meet, just before he died. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of this to show you, as it's still in storage. So it ought to be uncovered there too, I think. The Reverend Alfred Sells, an Anglican clergyman who lived from 1824 to 1908, at least his birth date is also given as 1822, so I'm not sure. He arrived in Melbourne in 1877 and was already a widower. He later lost 3 of his children to TB. He came to South Australia in the early 1880s and did many watercolours of places in the Barossa Valley, especially Pusey Vale, while he was the incumbent at Lindock Holy Trinity Church. He put many of his paintings into albums, and one of his works is the first done at Jacobs Creek. He later moved to Adelaide and was the incumbent of St Michael's Church at Mitcham. He returned to England in 1902. One of his albums is held by the State Library of South Australia. Here are some of his paintings. This is grass trees in the Barossa. This is near Lindock, 1878. Lindock Parsonage and the Lindock Church, 1879. I also found 2 anonymous works. Now these are interesting. If anyone's got information about these, I'd really love to have them, because they're, as far as I'm aware, anonymous. Done about this time as well. If anyone can shed any light on who might have painted them, I'd be pleased to know. They both have the year 1876 on them. The first one is the Victoria Mill in Gawler, and the second one is a general view of implements and stock on the form of Mr. John Riggs at Gawler Plains. So, I'm looking forward to hearing if anyone knows about those. The artist Louis Tallett arrived in Adelaide in 1881 and painted a magnificent portrait of Richard Schomburg. in 1883. Schomburg, who deserves a dissertation of his own, lived at Bucherfeld for a time with his brother Otto and became the founder and first director of the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. He quarrelled, you'll recall, with Mr. Minchin over the site of the zoo. However, it is to Richard that, among many other things, Gawler owes its wonderful stand of giant Moreton Bay fig trees on Julian Terrace. The Schomburgs had a younger brother, Julius, who arrived in Adelaide a year after them. First of all, here's the portrait of Schomburg, which is much better than my reproduction of it by Louis Tennant. And this is a photograph of his brother, Julius. The Schomburg brothers were a very talented family, and our state owes a considerable debt to them in a variety of areas, including the arts. Julius had trained as a silversmith in Germany and went to work for the German emigre jeweller J.M. Wendt in his shop in Rundle Street as chief designer and silversmith. There he produced some of the most exquisite examples of his art. He soon developed a well-earned reputation for his skills as a committed exponent of Victorian naturalism, incorporating in his designs a vast range of sculptural motifs. And here I'm going to talk about this beautiful piece of work, as well as Aboriginal figures. The John Ridley, and this is it, Testimonial Candelabrum, is one of the most spectacular of his works. It was presented to Ridley in 1861 for his work in developing his famous grain stripper. Note the miniature gold stripper on the top of the work. The sculpture comprises silver, gold, malachite and black wood, and it was created in 1860. In 1930, Ridley's daughter gave the candelabrum to the University of Adelaide's Waite Agricultural Research Institute, and it's now displayed in the Mitchell Building on North Terrace. Louis Tennant, who had painted the Richard Schomburg portrait, was a fellow German. They were both from Saxony, and he had studied art in Dusseldorf. He was appointed first honorary curator of the art gallery in 1881, and as well as head of the South Australian School of Design, and Tennant's portraits of Aboriginal people were very good. In South Australia, there seemed to be more interest in the plight of the Indigenous people than elsewhere. Adelaide was also the city that began to bring together, collected largely by South Australian German settlers, what is now the largest existing collection of Aboriginal art and artefacts in the preservation of the South Australian Museum. A contemporary of the Schomburgs was William Henry Starnes, who came to Adelaide from Sussex and was also living in Adelaide in the 1850s. He was a painter and coach builder and a member of the South Australian Society of Arts. One year, his enthusiasm led him to submit paintings for an exhibition under both his names, William and Henry. Perhaps he thought he'd have a better chance of winning a prize that way, who knows. Anyway, he went back to coach building for a while and took up exhibiting his art again 9 years later. He painted many portraits of the local Aboriginal people, as well as the corroboree at Humbug Scrub, which I showed you right at the beginning, near Runtree Hill. Corroborees were very exotic experiences for the white settlers, and many early artists painted them, including William Rudolph Thomas, who arrived in Adelaide in 1849 and stayed for 16 years. He painted the South Australian corroboree in 1864. Thomas was invited to be curator of the South Australian Society of Arts and in 1864, but he fell out with the society along with Shaw and several other artists at this time, despite having won 3 prizes. Here's his picture of the corroboree. At the turn of the century, another art form, often not properly acknowledged as such, was being created in Adelaide. And this was the art of creating stained glass. Stained glass and lead-like glass windows. E.F. Troy, I haven't discovered what the E.F. stood for, lived from 1858 to 1910, and he produced some beautiful stained glass windows for churches and other prominent buildings in and around Adelaide, including some lovely ones in the Anglican Church of St George in Gawler. He was born in Edinburgh in 1858 and came to Adelaide in the 1880s, and he had a flourishing stained glass business in Adelaide. He also lectured at the Adelaide School of Art and died in 1910. Here are two of his windows. And I'll come later to other glass artists who were active in Gawler in the 20th century. Photography too was already being seen as an art form at this time. George Loyo, who wrote in his book The Gawler Handbook in 1880 after he left his role as editor of the Bunyip, he wrote it, the Gawler Handbook, and it was published by Goodfellows and Healy of Adelaide. Interestingly, it is illustrated with 17 carte de visite photographs by James Taylor, the pioneer photographer who had a shop in Murray Street, Gawler, in the late 1880s. Carte de visite simply means visiting card, very popular with the better off in society for most of the 18th and 19th centuries. These at first only carried the owner's name and address, but in the late 19th century, a curious phenomenon, a craze in fact, hit Western Europe, America and here. The photographic carte de visite, which was invented by the Frenchman and André Disdery in 1854. They differed from earlier namesakes in that they now bore a sepia photograph of a famous person, a pet or family member, or of oneself, and they were usually about postcard size and made by printing the photo on thin paper and then pasting it onto the thicker card. People began collecting them and putting them in albums. And most of the Victorian photographs that you see that are postcard size and sepia would have come into that carte de visite category. And there are thousands and thousands of them. They became a common feature of the Victorian parlour. Taylor advertised his really good artistic portraits in the Gawler Mercury in December 1875 and possibly made his fortune, I don't know. He was born in Aberdeen in 1846 and arrived in Adelaide in 1864. Oddly, he died the same day as his wife in 1917. Taylor's artistic and historic photographs are part of an important collection in the State Library, but unfortunately I was unable to access any of them that had any local significance for us, apart from this photograph, which is of his shop in Murray Street. Captain Samuel Sweet arrived in Australia in 1864, and he was born in Hampshire, spent his early years as a sea captain, but he's mainly known now as a prolific photographer. The State Library has 920 of Sweet's photographs, the largest documentary photographic collection of South Australia in the 1870s and 80s. His mainly sepia photographs are now considered to have great artistic merit, as he became very adept at capturing mood, light, focus of interest and composition, and his work was often exhibited in prominent art galleries in Melbourne. He was also the only photographer to record the historic overland telegraph installation all the way from Adelaide to Darwin. Sweet travelled around with a horse-drawn darkroom using a dry plate stroke gelatin process at this time, and he died suddenly of sunstroke at Halldale, the home of the Hall family at Riverton, in 1886. A portfolio of his photos taken in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens was presented to the Prince of Wales by none other than Richard Schomburgk after it was exhibited at the Indian and Colonial Exhibition in 1886. Here is one of Sweet's photos of Buckland Park. You can see what the quality was like even then. In 1893, Coombe records a presentation was made by the Reverend John Pouncible to the town of Gawler of an oil painting of Gawler done in 1858. I could find nothing out about the good Reverend, so if anyone knows anything about him, the painting, I'd really like to know about it. I'd be grateful to hear. It may very well be in the Council's historic collection with many of the other artworks still to be resurrected. Albert Henry Forward was born near Birmingham in the UK in 1863 and arrived in Sydney in 1883. And he worked for John Sands in Sydney as an illustrator. He reproduced hand-coloured engravings, and one of them is the town of Gawler, and I'll show you the... this is his painting, and this is a photograph by Sweet, who I was talking about earlier. I'll go back. The inset looks like Gawler railway station. So what Forward added was smoke and a bit of colour, but it's really a reproduced photograph. And it's interesting how many of them did that. In the 1880s, Forward was actively painting with a prominent group of artists, including Frank Marnie, James Ashton, Tom Roberts and Arthur Streetman, the two latter, of course, of the Heidelberg School, very famous artists. Okay, so moving on. At the beginning of the 20th century, the first public sculpture for Gawler was erected on August 15th, 1903. The statue of James Martin was unveiled in Gawler by Sir Samuel Way, who was then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and who is his own statue on North Terrace. This fine Italian Carrara marble statue was commissioned by the Adelaide monumental mason G.E. Morgan and sculpted by the French, not Italian, as often thought, etcher, painter and sculptor Gustave-Henri Marchetti. Mr. T.H. Sleaton, a prominent Adelaide architect at the time and later Adelaide City Councillor and Labour MP, undertook to prepare the specifications for the sculptor free of charge, and the statue was ultimately paid for by a special memorial fund raised by public subscription. His statue is one of very few public three-dimensional works of art in Gawler. We don't have many. And in 2014, after many years being noseless and missing a finger, he's had them restored. It occurs to me that Marchetti probably carved the statue in France, and it may have come in pieces and then was assembled in Gawler, or it was shipped as a whole work. Once again, if anyone has any more accurate information to add, I'd welcome it. There is as well a fine marble bust of explorer John Mckinley, which was on the windowsill, or sorry, on the mantelpiece rather, in the reading room. But I haven't been able to find out who the sculptor is, so if anyone knows who did it, I'd be very pleased. We also have a McKinley Memorial in Murray Street to this important local explorer, and in 1874 the foundation stone for it was laid by his fellow explorer John Forrest. And it has a head of McKinley on the memorial, as well as an entwined Scotch thistles, as he was Scottish, with gum leaves, I think. The World War I Soldier Memorial on Adelaide Road was erected in 1921 by subscription from the residents of Gawler South and Gawler Belt, and unveiled in September of that year by Brigadier General Lean, who was then the Commissioner of Police in South Australia. And I quote from the budget from September 1921. The statue commemorates those who served in World War I and was unveiled before a multitude of people. An Australian soldier stands in full accoutrement over 17 feet high. From a rugged base arise an oblong stone on which are engraved the names of the 164 who enlisted from Gawler South and Gawler Belt, and on the other side the names of those who died overseas, 27 in all. Apart from grave statuary in the Anglican and Williston cemeteries, I'm not aware of any other significant sculptural work in Gawler from this period. However, a talented local sculptor was active in our area in the 20th century. More of him later. During this period, too, the council acquired an important print. At least I believe it probably is a print, although it's described in Coombs as a painting. I won't go into all the details about how they've made the different range of prints, but I suspect what Gawler has is a print and not an original. And here is a list of all the people who appear in the painting. Lawyers and politicians haven't changed much, have they? They like to have their names attached to whatever they're in. So that's the opening of the Commonwealth of Parliament, which we have a very fine print of here in Gawler. I now come to the reading room and library artworks. I've already talked about McCormack portraits, and my slides are taken from that booklet that I talked about that the library produced. Because of the current work going on in the redevelopment of the Civic Centre, my only access to these were from that booklet, for which I once again apologise, but it's particularly unfortunate in the case of this beautiful Rose Lauke delicate painting, Evening. This just does not do justice to this beautiful, beautiful painting. Rose Lauke was later Mrs. H.L. Sheard, the wife of the councillor of Gawler South Ward from 1925 to 1926. She was born in South Africa and came to Adelaide as an infant, and she lived from 1889 to 1968. The Australian Sales Digest lists 33 of her works, which are mostly impressionist landscapes. She studied in Adelaide with James Ashton and then later in London. The State Gallery has several of her works. Lauke's work was much admired in her day and still is. She was known as the female Arthur Streeton during her lifetime, although I prefer to call him a male Rose Lauke. So this is her beautiful painting called Evening. Next we have The Old Shepherd, Any Left Behind, and that's the title of a painting by George Bischoff in 1886. These are all from the reading room. Bishop was born in Spring Gully, not far from Gawler, in 1858, and was one of 7 children born to Henriette and Herman Bischoff, a German emigre who was president of the Gawler Institute from 1915 to 1916. George Bishop died aged 81 in October 1939 on King Island in Tasmania. The painting is, I think, an example of the style of the romanticised and idealised life of agricultural workers in the 19th century. I suspect it was a little bit more difficult and more rugged than is depicted in this picture. As an aside, Bishop Senior, the artist's father, who was president, whose presidential appointment is interesting as it was made in the middle of World War I, a period of high anti-German feeling in Australia. Fortunately, it doesn't appear to have affected his appointment in Gawler. Last but not least in the reading room is the beautiful painting of the 17th century playwright Molière. Molière was the stage name of Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, who lived from 1622 to 1673. He was a very famous French playwright and actor, often drawing criticism from the representatives of the French state and church for his satirical and critical exposés of the hypocrisy and corruption. The painting is actually called Molière reading excerpts of his comedies to his servant, and it's by the 19th century Italian artist Annibale Gatti, who lived from 1828 to 1909. I use the title that is in the listings of Gatti's work on the internet, where it's given in Italian. I could find no reference anywhere that described the work as his reading as Tartuffe, or that the lady listening had been promoted to housekeeper, so I'm not sure where those references come from originally. The painting was donated to the town by Lady Downer in 1915 in memory of her husband Sir John Downer, who had purchased it in Florence in 1887. Sir John was Premier of South Australia in 1885 and again in 1892. We're still trying to discover if this is Gatti's original work or a reproduction. While it is certainly recorded on his website as one of his works, most of which are accounted for and the locations are known, there is no information that I could find of where the original of this work is. Could this be it? As I read through E.H. Coombs' History of Gawler, I could find very few reference to the pursuit of the arts, at least specifically to painting or sculptures. And that's a great pity, I think. There is not even a reproduction in his book of Light's beautiful watercolours. Then there had been plenty of artists in the colony when he wrote that painting scenes of Gawler or its surrounds, but he did not either seem to be aware of them or it did not occur to him to consider them as visual important things to record in his book. So we come to the 20th century. In the Gawler sketchbook, first published in 1973 by Ridley and then subsequently in 1882, written by Ian All, there are detailed black and white drawings by Maurice Perry. Apart from a couple of exceptions, the illustrations are of buildings, as Perry was an architect by profession, but they are no less beautiful for that. Both men hailed from Borough originally, and the author was a member of the state's National Trust body. Gratifyingly, most of the buildings that Perry drew still exist. So this is the old Livery Stables, and this is a workman's cottage, which I think is in 4th Street. Derek Whitelock's book, Gawler, produced in 1889, almost 80 years after Coombe's, was part of Gawler's sesquicentenary publications. He does reproduce lights, paintings, and so on, which is great. Included too are a faded sketch of James Martin's first workshop by Dr. Knott, and another of him in watercolour of early Gawler. Whitelock's book also has very detailed drawings of the complex Phoenix Foundry and all its outbuildings, which there's a larger reproduction at the Gawler National Trust Museum. And also this beautiful drawn pencil sketch of the Eagle Foundry in King Street in the late 19th century by an artist unknown, I'm afraid, which is a great pity. And this is the Knott watercolour of Gawler. I know it's difficult to compile a broad and comprehensive history of a place in a short period of time, but I believe in the interest of inclusivity some recognition could be made of the arts and artists of Gawler when histories are being compiled. So now we come to the 20th century artists who are in the reading room. This first one is by Kay Harkness, and Kay, there aren't many women artists in the reading room, but this is one, and Kay's work is of Mr. L.B. or Laurie Ronan, who was president of the Gawler Institute from 1969 to 1970, and then again from 1981 to 91. Kay is a talented and still active painter and member of both the Gawler Art Society and the Gawler Community Gallery. I again apologise for the poor reproduction, because she is a very good artist, and Kay's painting deserves better than this. So hopefully we'll all be able to go and see the originals next year. There is also a fine portrait of Hilde Heinrich. Hilde was the last librarian of the Institute, and she received an OAM in 1982. Her portrait is by the very famous South Australian artist John Dowie. John is best known as a sculptor, although he obviously is a good artist, and he's famous for the Three Rivers Fountain in the centre of Victoria Square, the Vic Richardson Gates at the Adelaide Oval, and the statues of Sir Ross and Keith Smith at the Old Adelaide Airport. So this is a very valuable painting by him. Among the council's other art treasures are some beautiful pieces of embroidery, which included the Gawler Crest. And this is the crest, which is embroidered by ladies, 19 of them altogether, as part of the sesquicentenary celebrations. And also the same ladies produced a wall hanging, of which I've only got a part, but it's a much longer one, which has got a lot of sites, important sites in Gawler in it. Not a recent acquisition, but nevertheless a unique one, is a sampler and fine example of the intricate and detailed work expected of young girls in the 19th century. Agnes Glennie completed this in 1859 when she was 8 years old. She lived her whole life in Gawler and died in the Hutchinson Hospital in 1925. That's Agnes's sampler. Next we have a beautiful cushion cover by Beatrix Mcconnell. She was also known as Trix, done when she was a child, winning first prize in the 1908 Gawler show ahead of many entries of girls twice her age. Trix lived to be 100, dying in 2001. She had lived all of those years in Gawler, and it is an interesting connection that arises sometimes, quite coincidentally. I discovered that Trix's grandparents had migrated from England to Gawler in the early 1870s to join her grandfather's brother, Dan Sweeney. And Dan, it turns out, was employed by none other than George French Angus to build houses. So that's a nice circle closed there. This town also has a number of very talented quilters and textile artists who regularly exhibit their work at the Community Gallery and other places in and around Gawler, and many of these are original works of art, and we celebrate them in Gawler's Textile Weekend every 2 years in October. Since 2000, the Council has exhibited the overall winners of the 8 biennial Gawler Art Awards, an acquisitive award for which the town of Gawler provides the major prize. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of them currently, as they too are in storage. This year we'll see the 9th Gawler Art Award in September-October, so keep your eyes open for information about this in coming weeks. Other local artists of recent years are my late husband, Bill Gillett, who lived from 1935 to 1992. He arrived in Gawler in 1976 and worked from his studio in Gawler South. Examples of his lead-light work are in various homes in and around Gawler, particularly the front door of Craigley Mansion in High Street and the Lagana's home in Lyndoch. Bill was also a talented woodcarver, metalworker and potter. So they're 2 of his pieces. Julian Menace is another very important contemporary artist. She was born in the UK and lived over 20 years in Williston. She was an award-winning teacher as well as an incredibly talented artist. She taught Year 11 and 12 art in senior positions in the art department at Parawell's adult campus. Julia was one of those people who was inspirational and a great motivator, and she was in at the beginning of the battle to establish a community gallery for Gawler. She maintained her support of the gallery until her untimely death in 2016. She was also a very talented figure drawer, and this is one of her figure drawings. She established a yearly photographic exhibition at the Gawler Community Gallery, and the gallery continues the Julian Menace photography exhibition each year in her memory. This year's Julian Menace photographic exhibition is currently on at the gallery, so please go and see it. Just prior to her death, Julia ran a mosaic class from her home, and the pieces made by the members of that group were installed beside the skate park in Clonley Park, where unfortunately some of them have been vandalised, but they are still really worth a look. There is also an attractive modern sculpture in this garden, but I don't know who designed it. So this is one of those beautiful mosaics, and that's the sculpture. That's the sculpture, and I don't know who or what that's about. Pat Harbison, who many of you will know, is a long-time Gawler East resident and respected marine scientist, recognised nationally for her work, but she was also a very successful artist, especially in the area of stained glass. She also worked in watercolours, oils and pastels, and painted landscapes. She was an accomplished stained glass artist, undertaking glass mosaic and stained glass workshops at the Eagle Foundry, while Jeff and Liz New still owned it. Pat's stained glass windows feature in the church in Blinman. Unfortunately, I was unable to get any pictures of it. Jeff New, who I just mentioned, lived from 1934 to 2010. He came to Gawler in the early 70s and was a long-time resident at Bibberinga. His father, Esmond, was an accomplished artist, and one of his sons, Daniel, is a very successful freelance professional artist illustrator in Sydney. Jeff trained at the RMIT in Melbourne and was a high school teacher. He was talented in several areas: painting, sculpture, moulding, printing, pottery and mosaic. He tried his hand at everything, including poetry. He was also, until his death, very active on environmental and heritage issues in our area. Jeff was a tutor at the art department of the old Gawler TAFE when it was on the site where Big W Woolies now stands. He worked with unemployed young people as part of the then Community Youth Support Scheme, or CYS, to create the wonderful mosaic mural. That's one of his paintings, and that's one of his pots. And I'll come to the mural on the toilet in a minute. He was talented in lots of areas, and then he did this beautiful mural with these people who are unemployed, young people who are unemployed, and it's of the boating scene of the dammed South Para, which was dammed into a lake in the 1920s so people could row on it. And I'll show you that, talk about that a bit later. It is hoped that when this toilet block is demolished as part of the Walker Place revamp, that the mural can be saved and reconstructed on another site. Jeff and wife Liz bought the Eagle Foundry in the 1970s, and with the assistance of the Arts Council grants, encouraged and facilitated the work of other artists there, including, as I mentioned, Pat Harbison, particularly two internationally famous US glass artists, David Ruth and Paul Marioni, as well as potters and wrought iron artists. I also discovered current landscape artist David Gandy while trolling the internet, and he was born in Gawler. My husband David and I became close friends with an important sculptor in our area, Chris Redford. Chris, who died 2 years ago at the age of 99, had been a British Army captain in World War II and was mentioned in dispatches for bravery during the evacuation of Dunkirk. He came to Australia from the UK in middle age. I attended classes he gave in art from the early 1980s to 1990s in the old post office building and tourism office in Murray Street, where the clock tower is. Chris was a polymath, a car designer for Holden's in Melbourne, and then an art teacher before retiring to Freeling. He sculpted the well-known statues of the Pioneer Family Group in Freeling, the man and his Clydesdale horse in Angaston, called A Day Off for Peter, and the statue of Barossa-born South Australian educator and writer Colin Teeley with a pelican, reminiscent of his Coorong story Storm Boy. This is in the public gardens in Udunda. Teeley was born to German descendants in the area close to Udunda. Chris also did the sculpture of the folded bunyip, which was in the awning by the big gum tree in Commercial Lane, and the bust of Gawler poet and musician Martin Johnson in the Gawler Library. He taught himself to make violins when he was in his 80s, as you do. One of these, his son Nick, plays in the Doctors' Orchestra in Melbourne. Chris was a great thinker and wit, and also enjoyed writing poetry. So there's his statue of the horse and man in Angaston, and that's his one of Colin Teeley in Udunda. Another local artist is Audrey Harnett, a fine artist and jeweller who for several years ran a small flourishing gallery at the Prince Albert Hotel in the early 2000s. She has gone on to have many successful exhibitions in her own right. Others are Malcolm Richards, a Gawler resident and local GP, who is a state-recognised artist and has exhibited widely in Adelaide and recently completed a degree in fine arts in Gawler. Gerhard Ritter is a state and nationally acclaimed artist who lives at Blakeview and has won the Gawler Art Award on several occasions and has since been one of our judges. Now I come back to Scott Rathman and Margaret Ferrugia, are two prominent Indigenous artists living and working in Gawler. Margaret was a long-time active member of the Gawler Community Gallery until her health limited her involvement. She did many very moving paintings dealing with her stolen generation experience and is exhibited widely. Scott's public art is visible in many public places around the town, and he also exhibits his work widely and is a very important contributor to the Sala Festival in Gawler. Both Margaret and Scott are important leaders in the Reconciliation and NAIDOC Week celebrations held in Gawler every year. And while I'm talking about public spaces, I'll include, alongside Scott's work, Jeff's one of the toilet. That's the mural that Jeff oversaw with the CIS students. And these other two are by Scott Rathman and the multi-storey car park. I also discovered another Indigenous artist who was born in Gawler, a Dr. Christian Thompson, but I couldn't find out too much about him. Another one is Sue Adams, who also had a small gallery in Gawler for a while in the 2000s. And Norm Nilsson has had a successful art studio and class in the arcade off Southern Murray Street for many years. It is one of the very few places consistently offering art tutorship to children and young people in our town. Norm painted a magnificent life-size portrait of the late Gawler icon Bryant Larney, and also one of explorer John Mckinley as part of a permanent display about that explorer in the Gawler National Trust Museum. George Aldrich is a widely known and admired artist and lived in Gawler for many years and still has a very soft spot for it. He is deservedly famous for his excellent landscapes of the Flinders Ranges, but is equally well known as a serious portraitist and for his very clever and beautifully drawn caricatures of many Gawler locals and his topical cartoons appearing weekly in the Bunyip. In the 1990s, George achieved international fame by winning a prestigious international cartoonist competition for which he was flown to Portugal to receive his award. And that was a front page of the Bunyip that George did a few years ago, just to give you some examples of his cartooning or caricaturing. And this, and I'm sorry that it's not a better reproduction, but it's a beautiful painting that he did for my brother-in-law, Tom. A history of art in Gawler would not be deserving of the name without mention of the Gawler Art Society. This very important local organisation has existed in Gawler for over 70 years, but still doesn't have a permanent home. Its members support one another and they run regular classes and workshops. They go on organised field trips and hold several exhibitions each year in various locations in and around Gawler. They have among their membership some very fine artists. The Society's membership overlaps considerably and not surprisingly with that of the Gawler Art Gallery. Establishing a community-based art gallery in Gawler was a battle that began in 2000 when a group of us calling ourselves Arts Action began looking for suitable sites locally and to lobby council. And I could go into some detail about that, but I won't. However, finally we were able to get the Station Master's house at the Gawler Station through the good offices of Pat Mills, the late wonderful man Pat Mills. And this is one that my late husband Bill, it's a tapestry that he did of the station. The house was in a seriously, there's the house at the end there, two-storey building. The house was in a seriously degraded, rat-infested, dilapidated state. Pat Mills organised and supervised its total renovation through Work for the Dole. And they did a wonderful job. And we've been there ever since. Prior to that, Arts Action held the first three biennial Gawler Art Awards at various sites around Gawler. Once the gallery opened, Arts Action disbanded and many of its members became its first management committee. And it's now been going for 12 years. Other notable art events in our town are the South Australian Living Artists Month, which Gawler always embraces wholeheartedly, the annual Gawler Shows Art Exhibition, the Village Fair Youth Art Exhibition, and of course the magnificent biannual Textile Weekend. Two of my former teaching colleagues and both local residents, Naomi Arnold-Reschke and Sandra Lowry, former principal of Gawler High for many years, are now qualified volunteer guides at the Art Gallery of South Australia, both having to learn a great deal about the complex and massive collection that gallery holds, and also about individual visiting exhibitions and their participating artists. What a job, what dedication. Finally, I believe we have an important art event occurring in the not-too-distant future in our town. For those of you who neglected to read the article in the Bunyip a few months ago, or the flyer that came with your rates notice at the end of January, I quote, "A joint initiative of the town of Gawler and the RSL Gawler sub-branch. Both nationally renowned and internationally renowned South Australian artist Robert Hannaford, AM, who lives in Riverton, and who recently had his own exhibition at the State Gallery dedicated to his work, has designed a unique, original and significant work for Gawler in South Australia. Mr. Hannaford describes the memorial as an abstract, enigmatic form conveying the feeling of service, war, conflict and peacekeeping." And this piece of work is going to be in Pioneer Park. The flyer goes on to acknowledge Council's major local sponsors, and I won't go into all that, but there's a contact name if anyone wants to contribute to it. This is his initial sketch for the work, but it will be not very good at estimating, but that bench is about how long it'll be, and you can see it'll be on a pedestal of some sort, and bronze. If you're interested, you could go to the council's website, and you can actually see Robert Hannaford in his studio with the clay maquette of this life-size work. In this modern age of instant photography, it's worth remembering that for millennia, paintings and drawings and carvings were the only means we humans had of communicating and recording both our everyday lives and our inner spiritual lives, and those of the people and places around us. The art of writing followed much, much later. Without art, we would have very little idea of what our world or our country, and specifically Gawler and its surrounds, looked like before photography. Thank you to all those past artists and to all the present ones too. I really hope I haven't overlooked too many.
I think it'd be fair to say that you couldn't get a much more comprehensive resume of the art associated with Gawler, and fabulous, thank you very much. Tony, the night's getting on a bit, so we'll just
hard act to follow.
Eh? Hard act to follow, Tony.
Why?
You can do it. You can do it.
Well done, Judy. Thank you very much. It was an honour to be here.
Sorry,
That's you later. That's you later.
Today?
That's a secret. That was fantastic. I mean, that's how research should be done. I mean, she spent hours and hours and hours working through this, with notes, but but that was fantastic. And to go back so far, when I came tonight, I thought, well, what are we going to get tonight, What are we going to get tonight? And I thought from 1930s onwards, I don't have any artist in Gawler, She goes back to the Aborigines and Ghana. I thought that in itself was an idea of where to start, and to continue on and fill all the people in between. That was tremendous. Personally, you hit a few soft spots. One with George French Angus. I've got one of his. And I would have brought it if I'd known, but it's actually one of Mount Gambier, not Gawler. And how these European artists used to go home and finish off. On my George French Angus, he's got the Blue Lake and a lot of English trees on the top. Yeah, he finishes them at home, doesn't he? Yeah. And then Mrs. Heinrich sitting in the Institute office. I can remember her in the 60s, going past and taking her sandwiches. Yeah.
I can remember it too.
You can remember that photo too? You're too young for that, I don't believe you.
Oh, I'll come back.
Yeah, well, look, that was really more than I expected. It was fantastic. And your research work, you can have a rest now.
Well, Dave will tell you, it wasn't a long time.
Hey?
So, we have
what
now
one.
the surprise bit.
Long time.
Now the surprise bit.
Oh,
We want
wow.
to keep it going for a day or two.
That's fantastic.
Enjoy them.
Very, very nice.